You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Your neighborhood just got cooler with Kroger Delivery's refrigerated trucks. Simply order groceries at the same great prices online as in-store, and we'll bring them to you fresh every time. And if that wasn't cool enough, you can now earn 4 times the fuel points after 4 with your digital coupon. Choose a next-day Kroger delivery time slot for 4 p.m. or later on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Must deliver by February 4th. Restrictions apply. See Kroger.com for details.
Hello everyone and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time I'm very pleased to be joined by Jack Browsher, who is part of a team putting together a new Second World War podcast which covers the Burma campaign. The new podcast is called The Forgotten War and is available starting February 3rd, 2025, which, if you're listening to this on release day, means that you can go out and start listening right now.
So yeah, I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me again, Wesley. Yeah, we're looking forward to getting Series 1 of the Forgotten War pod up and running. You know, I'm working hard. You know, I've got a deadline coming soon for my second book. So it's a really busy but exciting time at the moment.
I know you've written some books about the war, the campaign. What made you decide to start a podcast?
So the big thing for Rob and I, so, you know, my co-host, Robert Lyman, so, you know, he's been a historian of the Burma campaign, or historian in general, actually, for sort of 30 years. I'm a relative newcomer. Essentially, it was where we've known each other for quite a few years now. We've sort of met each other on the sort of the history sort of festivals and doing talks and that sort of thing. And it's just the idea that, you know, lots and lots of other podcasts have done the odd episode here and there, and they've done brilliant jobs in covering elements of the Burma campaign. But the thing that's always sort of missing for the both of us, you know, and we're the kind of people that have been guests on other people's podcasts talking about things, is there's only ever sort of the same highlights that get talked about. I mean, occasionally something a bit unusual is spoken about. You know, I'm particularly an expert on armoured warfare in the Burma campaign. You know, that's really where I started. A sort of a bit of an unknown sort of area of that war. People don't think of tanks in the jungle and that sort of thing. But it got us realising that actually there is so much to talk about. You know, the Burma campaign is incredibly complex. It's a very, very multinational effort. You know, one of the things we make a big deal on the podcast is, you know, a big deal of it is about China, even though a lot of people don't realise that. You know, the big mistake people often make about the Burma campaign is that it's about things like rubber and oil. And, you know, really actually what China's after is cutting off China from American Lend-Lease supplies, really. But because it's neighbouring to India, it kind of falls on the Indian army, the British army and so on. But also East African soldiers, West African soldiers, small numbers Australian. Lots of Canadians end up there in the Royal Canadian Air Force in particular as well. And I think the other thing as well for your listeners is that perhaps unless people are really into the Burma campaign, there's actually twice as many Americans serve in the Burma campaign as Brits. And that's mostly actually in the support services or the United States Air Force. Most of the foot slogging is done by the Indian army. But like most of the American sort of logistical backup or most of the logistical backup is, you know, the 277,000 Americans that are there. And what our podcast is all about is not just about telling the story of the campaign as a whole, and that's what Series 1 is, a high-level look at the whole campaign. Future series will take deep dives into all sorts, interviews, and so on. But we want to really try and get the message out there. It's not just an Indian thing. It's not just a British thing, in particular a British thing. We want to move away from that. That will be a big part of it. But it is a massive multinational effort, and we want to tell that story in a way that, you know, generally speaking, other podcasts with wider remits don't ever get the chance to do.
That is a great point about being on specific interviews on podcasts and other short bits of content when it comes to something like the events in Burma, where the average knowledge for listeners is so low. Even people who are interested in the Second World War might not know very much, and you probably end up spending most of your time just giving the same basic introduction to the topic without being able to really dive into a lot of detail.
Yeah, of course. And obviously, the other thing we should say is that, nowadays Myanmar is the name of the country, so it's not even got the same name. We specifically use Burma and the Burma campaign because that is what everyone called it at the time. It's what all of the war diaries, everything, the maps, everything. So we use the word Burma as the contemporary use of the word, but we are referring to modern day Myanmar. And yeah, the name of our podcast, The Forgotten War Pod, the forgotten thing in lots of histories, the forgotten this, the forgotten that. My first book is called Forgotten Armour. All of this comes down to the fact that the soldiers themselves had that same conception that, that the army that they were fighting was completely forgotten about at home. So they called themselves the Forgotten Army. So 14th Army, because the British Army numbered its armies from sort of the second half of the war, or sort of for the sort of last sort of 2/3 of the war. So they were the 14th Army, but everyone nicknamed them at the time they were the Forgotten Army. And that's really where it all has stemmed from, really, the idea that, again, we want to discuss that, get that out, get it back into sort of a more wider audience.
We talked a little bit about yourself and your books, but you're also joined by Robert Lyman on the podcast, and he's written quite a bit about this topic. Isn't that right?
Yeah, like I said, he's Dr. Robert Lyman, MBE. So yeah, he's not funny about that, but he's not he won't be annoyed at me for not bringing that up. But he really has been. He is probably in the United Kingdom, certainly, he is the sort of the premier historian of the Burma campaign as a whole. He's been Slim's biographer. So for those that don't know, Bill Slim was the Lieutenant General in charge of 14th Army, the Forgotten Army. Robert Lyman was his biographer. He's been doing this for an awful long time. He's very involved as well in the modern day. There's a charity in India that he's involved with to do with educating the people that are descended from the group that helped sort of SOE, so the Special Operations Executive, the Naga Hill people, the Naga tribe. He's involved with a charity that helps them with further education from that part of India. He travels out there as a guide as well. He does battlefield tours out there. He's genuinely the premier historian on the entire campaign. I'm the Johnny come lately, and we have slightly different overall purviews. His general sort of historical thing has been majority has been the leadership thing, although obviously he has done lots of work at lower levels of command and of the fighting as well. He's a fantastic historian. I strongly commend his books to you and your listeners. My thing has generally been about, I like the on the ground, boots on the ground, the guy in the turret of the tank and that sort of thing, the guys that are slogging through the jungles in monsoon and almost like the soldier's experience. We both sort of cross over into each other's sort of areas, but we are both there as sort of a partnership, really, to try and tell that entire story from all of those angles.
What's kind of the structure of the podcast, and how are you approaching this quite large topic?
The first series is quite specific. So you've already mentioned this. We're very, very, very aware of the fact that a lot of people don't know the Burma campaign very well. The kind of things that people probably remember is, if they know anything about it at all, and that's quite important, is they have probably heard of Kohima, they've probably heard of Imphal, but even then, again, there will be plenty of people that haven't. And the Chindits, who are they're a force of specially trained, sort of like originally a brigade force. They get larger later, where they go behind Japanese lines and try to cause havoc. And they're probably slightly too big for their own good. Their leader, Ord Wingate, is a character, to say the least. This is not a Wingate podcast, but he absolutely will be a key character in any podcast about the Chindits, because he's such a larger-than-life character. Those are probably the things that people have heard of. So what we're going to do is the very first series of 12 episodes. I suppose it's 11 episodes, plus we're going to do a Q&A episode at the end. We're going to do the entire sweep of the campaign. So we're going to start with the origins and the sort of the people of the campaign, key characters, key themes, that sort of thing. And we're going to go right the way through sort of the major events. So the retreat from Burma in 1942, when the Japanese first invade, the fighting withdrawal for 1,000 miles, the longest retreat the British and Indian armies have had to endure. We then talk about sort of the various attempts to try and strike back in a couple of the other regions. There's an area called Arakan, a very heavily jungled area. We go through the huge failures of those sorts of things, the fact they have to redevelop the army, it has to be changed sort of from the ground up. There are real fundamentals that need fixing, sort of from those first 2 years of the war. And then we get to the Japanese, the attempts for them to invade India. We've got a couple of episodes on the Chindits as well. The Americans in Northern Combat Area Command, we've got an episode on that. Right the way through sort of the strike back after the Indian invasion at Imphal and Kohima. And then the push back into Burma and the sort of, and what my second book is about, the Battle of Mektila, the sort of the last giant battle of the war, but also the Battle of Mandalay, which happens concurrently. These two battles happen sort of a couple hundred miles apart, and they're both very important. We have the episodes on those, and then finally, we get to the end of the war at Rangoon, 3.5 years later, 11 episodes later. And like I say, we'll end on a Q&A. But then future series are all about going ahead and, so we've lined up a few guests, some quite big ones. So I'm not going to do spoilers just yet, but, because there's still some T's to cross and some I's to dot. But we have got some pretty big names, both from a historian perspective, but also actually some people whose relatives were involved in the campaign at a high level as well. So that are going to come on. But also some historians, there's a couple of different historians that we want to talk to about their specific areas. So, you mentioned bringing people on to talk about their specific areas of expertise. Absolutely want to do that. Other people as well. We want to bring in other people. But also as well, the sort of, again, a bit like Series 1, we will do more episodes on the sort of the narrative of specific things. But, Series 1 is, a very broad, high-level narrative of the basics of what the whole campaign is for 3.5 years in 11 episodes, quite a big task. So that future narrative episodes will be about deep dives, 2-3 episodes on individual battles, or, 2 episodes on key people that are, that a single episode or a single chronological narrative episode could never do them justice.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about Lend-Lease and why the Burma campaign is so important around that topic. And maybe I'm just showcasing my own ignorance here, but how would you describe to people who are interested in the Second World War why they should learn more about Burma? Was it because there were some roads that ran through it to China? Is that it?
I mean, yeah, the effective reason is for America, for much of the 1930s in particular, China is the future Asiatic power. They want to build China up to be nationalist China, I should say, because obviously not communist China. That's not what the American intention is. It's definitely nationalist China. They want to build China up to be, basically their partner. And I'm massively simplifying, but effectively America's partner in Asia, stemming the sort of the rise of both the Soviet Union, the concerns of Soviet Union's ambitions in so modern day Russia, but their ambitions in Asia, and also Japan as the other rising power. There's the Soviet Empire. The Soviets are obviously overhanging a lot of Russian Empire attitudes towards Asia, whereas Japan is the rising power as well, where their feeling is if they can bolster China, with its massive population in particular, they can temper both of those two expansions. So therefore, they feed the Chinese with the resources to continue the fight against the Japanese. Starting in the early 1930s, the Mukden incident, for example, where, the first sort of, the Japanese begin to encroach on Chinese territory from their sort of trade bastions. If you think of places like, the British had Hong Kong and so on, the Japanese have similar enclaves as well. And they begin to encroach. And I'm slightly simplifying here, for time. Then you have, later in the 1930s, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the very famous one. That's the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the sort of the more famous one. Some scholars, and certainly in China, they would consider this the beginning of the Second World War in 1937. This opening of the war between China and Japan at this point. And so America is constantly feeding supplies through. And, in the early days of the Second Sino-Japanese War, some of them get shifted into Indochina, so modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, because it's safer for the shipping routes than, possibly seeing Japanese attacks on American shipping going in through the more obvious routes into China. But then Japan cuts that route to Indochina. They invade northern Indochina. And that's where Burma enters the chat, essentially. So part of the British Empire, it's run from India like it's part of India, but actually it's very culturally distinct. There is a lot of animosity between certain ethnic groups within Burma and the Indians, and in fact most of Burma actually. In fact, there have been wars of conquest and things like that, and the cultural differences effectively because the border with India and Burma is incredibly high up in the mountains and incredibly thickly jungled, and also there is a major river, the River Chindwin, that separates the two countries. So they have developed in their earlier histories quite distinctly. But they are run as that single, it's like an extension of British India. It's only been added in the Victorian period to the sort of the British sphere of influence, the empire, as it were. And so it's run from this area. And America uses Rangoon in southern Burma as this new base because they've lost Indochina as the route in. And so the supplies make their way up Rangoon. So the Japanese essentially invade to cut this off, and it's always important to understand is most of Chinese strength in the Far East is, it is taken up by, the Japanese army, the Imperial Japanese Army strength is taken up in China, a million Japanese soldiers. That is far more than ever fighting Burma. That's far more than fighting the Pacific. But obviously, things like the power in the Pacific is as much about the Japanese Navy. So it's not about raw individuals that I'm saying here. But in terms of, imagine that the Japanese could supplement their island bastions at places like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, the Philippines, Guadalcanal earlier, if they'd had the access to those millions of men that were in China, if China had previously been pacified. So America absolutely understands the importance of keeping China in the fight. And China is in an awful position as well, because Chiang Kai-shek is also fighting the communists as well. And it takes a lot of politicking that, again, we probably don't have time to go into, to try and stop the Chinese Civil War starting in the middle of the Second World War, because it kicks off truly kicks off after the Second World War. And that's really what it is. It's about keep China in. Burma just becomes the road for it. Japan invades Burma. The British are pushed out in sort of 4 months or so, 3.5, 4 months, from January to 5 months, sorry. So January sort of through to May of 1942, cutting off that road. And again, that leads to an influx of even more Americans, because now they want to build a load of airfields, and they create. And again, if any of your listeners have got relatives that were involved, they're bound. Odds are they will be involved in this. The Hump airlift, probably the most famous part. And so American servicemen are building the airfields. They're manning the United States Army Air Force, C-47 Dakotas, C-46 Commandos, that sort of thing, flying the Hump airlift, taking the supplies by air over the Himalaya mountains. In the very, very odd chance that your American listeners get to go to northern India, because it's not an easy place to get to; it's expensive as well. But there is a fantastic new museum that Rob has recently been to and strongly recommends at Lado, which was the beginning of the road that was being built to resupply China, partly during the Hump airlift, but also then, the whole of the Burma campaign is at least in part to rebuild a road link back to China, because obviously any airlift is never going to be as efficient as a road link. And so the Burma campaign is effectively about reopening that road. And to a degree, tying down Japanese troops, in total, this is the total, this isn't the maximum. The total that ever end up serving is about 250,000 Japanese end up fighting in Burma. That include, there's ebbs and flows and casualties and so on. So it's a total of 250,000 rotate through there, if you see what I mean. So it's not an insignificant campaign, but its real job really is about keeping the Chinese in the war.
You mentioned how many men and how much effort was involved in Burma, especially around something like the airlift. Just the number of resources put into that kind of effort, the bombers, the men. It's one of those topics that maybe feels like it would have been more important to some of the people at the time, maybe the leaders involved in the nations. Maybe they thought it was super important, even if some of that importance has sort of faded away. Is that what has happened here?
Yeah, it's not just that. At the time, it is the forgotten campaign at the end of the day. And also the other thing as well that's obviously we always remember combat roles. Think about the way that, and this is not a criticism of it, but the way that, say, Easy Company of the 506, Band of Brothers and all that, how famous they've become. And it's a fantastic story. I loved Band of Brothers, really formative part, of my, entry into it. It's not the only thing. I was already interested in World War II, but, I was 13, 14 years old when that came out. But my point is, we focus on combat so much, and I'm guilty of it as any person. My books do focus on combat as well, although in Forgotten Armour in particular, as well as the combat, I do like to try and make sure that we think about the logistical side of it, the training side of it. But at the end of the day, most of our history books like to focus on combat or drama, the human dramas and so on. And so, the importance of men, just slogging away, building these roads through, up and down these mountainous, twisting switchback roads, hacking jungle out by hand because you can't get the heavy machinery into these mountains, is massively forgotten. But it's the experience of most of the American servicemen that ever served in Burma. For British and Indian soldiers, obviously they are the teeth of it. In fact, in terms of American troops, what your listeners will probably have heard of is Merrill's Marauders. But there are only about 4,000 of the 277,000 that serve. But yet they're probably the most famous American servicemen, maybe bar the people like the pilots in the United States Air Force that are in Burma as well. I mean, if there was there is an American that I will commend, and I'm looking around because I know the book's here somewhere. I've got them all piled up because I'm in the middle of writing. But there is an American called Scott Gilmore, who, again, if your listeners want to get he writes a wonderful memoir, and he has an amazing story. So he's from Connecticut. He calls his book A Connecticut Yankee in the 4th and 8th Gurkha Rifles. So a bit of mouthful, but he basically he volunteers to go to North Africa at the beginning of before Pearl Harbor. He volunteers to become an ambulance driver, and I've forgotten the name of the group that he's basically part of. But he's an ambulance driver in North Africa for the British Army. So it's an American volunteer group, although AVG's the Flying Tigers in Burma. Actually, there are Americans actually flying aircraft at the beginning of the Burma campaign, actually firing Kitty Hawks, the Flying Tigers. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about Scott Gilmore. Scott Gilmore, amazing guy. He volunteers to go to North Africa. He becomes a ambulance driver. He fights at places like he goes to Tobruk. If you're, if people have heard of Tobruk in North Africa, he fights at El Alamein, which I'm sure your listeners have heard of. But at this point, he's there as a non-combatant. But whilst he's in Cairo in Egypt, he sees adverts. Basically, the Indian Army are advertising. So what's happening here, and I talk about this in the books and stuff, the Indian Army expands massively. It's the largest volunteer army in the Second World War. It's 2 million men by the end of the war of Indian soldiers. Obviously, they need manpower, and because it's a colonial army, it also needs officers. Now, the Indian Army does Indianize. They call it Indianization. So they are, by 1945, there is a huge amount of Indian officers in the Indian Army. So what they do is they do advertise, though, to have British officers is what they're aiming for. But, Scott Gilmore's there. He's at the end of his sort of contract with, his volunteer time as an ambulance driver. And he's interested essentially in finding another role, and he'd like to take that step up. And basically he answers an advert in Cairo, like posters, reports to an Indian Army recruitment sort of base, and basically says, I'd like to join the Indian Army. I'd like to be commissioned because it's an advert for officers. He wants to be an officer, and so he goes and volunteers, and so he's taken off to India. He goes up to Nepal. He learns how to speak Gurkhali, so the Nepalese language that Gurkhas, for the listeners that don't know, Gurkhas are and they're still part of the British Army today. There are Gurkhas in the British Army today. They go over to he goes over to India, Gilmore, and he becomes an officer in the Gurkhas. He learns Gurkhali for a few months. He has lots and lots of training, and then he takes part in the Battle of the Admin Box, which is a very, very famous battle in Britain, or a relatively famous battle in Britain. And it's called the Admin Box because basically the Japanese surround, as they often do. They like to infiltrate through the jungle behind British units, and they surround Scott Gilmore's part of his division. He's in the 4th and 8th Gurkhas. He ends up in the 7th Indian Division. And basically, he's surrounded in the administration area. So the fighting brigades, so in the American Army, a brigade is a regiment, 3,000 men, 3 battalions. Scott Gilmore's battalion, the 4th and 8th Gurkhas, so, and also that shorthand is a curiosity really to the Indian Army. He's the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Regiment. So it shows you the size that the Indian Army gets to, that's the 4th Battalion of an 8th Regiment. Although obviously the regimental system in America is very different. That's brigades. It gets all confusing. It's really annoying if you're trying to sort of jump between these two different kinds of nomenclatures. So apologies if people aren't quite keeping up. But he's an officer basically at sort of platoon level, and he's surrounded by the Japanese with about a couple of thousand other men, and they're all things like, apart from a few infantry battalions like his own, there's also one called the 2nd West Yorkshire Regiment, and they're British soldiers. Most of the other people inside this admin box, it's cooks, it's typists, mechanics for the motor pool for the division, and they're all having to dig in their foxholes and fight off Japanese attacks. And he's lucky because he's a trained infantryman and he's surrounded by other trained infantrymen, and his men are placed in between. To his right flank might be held by a bunch of cooks, And his left flank is a bunch of mechanics, none of whom have really had, a comprehensive infantry training. And, one of the big changes in the Indian Army was actually everyone was a rifleman and whatever their other job was next. But they're still not as well, the training is always going to be different at the end of the day, even if you have some patrol work and all this sort of stuff. And so he fights through the Battle of the Ad Box, and his memoir is fantastically evocative of his experiences, charging up these hills to push the Japanese off them, who are surrounding them on this little box on all sides. And he fights through all of that. And then he invades Burma the following year, or, a year later, he crosses the Irrawaddy River, this great river. We talk about the crossing of the Rhine as this great moment in, the history of the Second World War in March 1945. 350 odd metres across, 400 metres across. The Irrawaddy is about 1,200 metres across at the point where the Allies attack it. And at the crossing of the Rhine, they're using, lots of leftover stuff from D-Day. They're using the Buffalo LVT things. If you've seen the Pacific when they attack Peleliu, those tracked vehicles that take troops to tour, they're crossing over in these canvas boats for, like 3/4 of a mile or whatever it is, under fire as well as they get to the end of it. Scott Gilmore's in one of the follow-up waves, and then they fight to hold this thing. Honestly, I strongly recommend A Connecticut Yankee in the 4th and 8th Gurkha Rifles. If you want to hear about an American in the Burma campaign, that's the memoir par excellence, and you can find it. It's not that difficult to find.
That is amazing. The journeys of some men during the war are just the most bizarre sequence of events. Like, he volunteered to be, a driver maybe of an ambulance in North Africa, and then suddenly he's all the way over there in India.
Precisely, and he's a very funny guy. I mean, he has very good friends. If you want another book to go with him, there's a Patrick Davis called A Child at Arms. They write kind of parallel books, and they talk about each other writing the other guy's book. And one of them helped the other one. They were clearly like the best mates. Between the two of them, they tell a really good version of the whole war in Burma.
Hey Atlanta, say hello to Small Business Help from Apple. That's right, we're here to make starting and running your business simpler. From helping you choose the right devices to setting them up hassle-free, we can help you build your business in no time. Speak to a business expert and get the help you need at no cost whatsoever. At Apple, we're open for your small business. Go to apple.com/smallbusiness or visit an Apple store to learn more.
Valentine's Day is just around the corner, and nothing says love like the warmth and comfort of a Miki Couture blanket. Whether it's for your sweetheart, your best friend, or even yourself, Miki Couture has the perfect gift to make hearts melt. From luxurious textures to stylish designs, Miki Couture blankets are the ultimate way to show you care. Plus, now through Valentine's Day, enjoy exclusive savings on our limited edition Valentine's collection. Visit any of our stores or shop online at www.mikicouture.com and give the gift of love, comfort, and warmth this Valentine's Day. Miki Couture, blanketing the world in warmth and love.
Now, I would be remiss if I had you on a call on an interview and I did not ask you about tanks in the jungle. So what is happening with armor during the Burma campaign? It's not really an area of fighting where I would expect there to be, a major armored presence or any armored presence. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, too. And that's the thing, is that's what everybody always assume. And the thing is, the armoured campaign, that's not quite the right way to describe it, I suppose. The role of armour in the campaign is relatively small. It's far smaller than any other group there. There are only ever, approximately speaking, maximum three brigades of tanks. Okay. So, that's effectively the equivalent of a single division, although, again, sort of slightly complicated organisation of armies. An armoured division isn't actually 3 tank brigades, but it's the equivalent of a division worth of tanks if you had a fully armoured all the brigades in a division were at any one time. And right at the beginning, there was only one brigade. In fact, the very first weeks, there were no tanks of any value anyway. And the reason why essentially that I got into the tanks in Burma thing was doing a master's in military history, and I was kind of searching around for different ideas. And this is really where I met Rob, the Forgotten War Pod's co-host, Rob Lyman, was seeing him speak at a festival when I was a punter. And I'd signed up for my master's, but I hadn't started, and basically had a conversation with him about the mechanisation of India, because he gave a talk that touched on it, about the building of the Indian army after the war started, that expansion. It went from 200,000 to 2 million in a couple of years, and it talked about the mechanisation process as a whole. So it wasn't just tanks; it was about lorries and all sorts. He basically got me talking about it. We got talking about it, and he was like, that would be a really interesting thing. Why don't you do that? And so I ended up doing it as my dissertation. But it morphed into the tank warfare side, and the reason for that was I'd read a number of books. I've been very interested in the Burma campaign, although I don't have a relative part of it. My connection to the Burma campaign is distant. I come from a part of England where a very famous battle involved people from where I grew up. That's the closest I have to a connection. But I was reading books where there were things like, it said, there was so-and-so action, and the famous one, actually, there's a specific example. I was reading about the Battle of Kohima, which is a battle that's relatively small in geographical location, relatively small numbers, but very, very important because it's kind of like the last line of defence before India in the Japanese invasion in 1944. And it's in particular famous because at one point on one part of the battlefield, no man's land is the width of a local district commissioner's bungalow, and it's his tennis court in the grounds of his bungalow, and the trenches are on either side, not the length of the tennis court, it's the sides of the tennis court. It is spitting distance of the two sides, and they fight over this tennis court. So from the day that the front line shifts to either side of the tennis court, they fight over that for 39 days. Now, there's other parts of the battle going on at the same time, but a tennis court, and it's 39 days. Now, in a number of different books, what you basically get is when the tennis court is finally captured after those 39 days, it just says, and then on the 13th of May, 1944, the tennis court was cleared with the help of a tank. And my thing was, what was that story? How do you have 39 days of fighting, and no breakthrough, and that one tank changes that game? Just the one tank. It's literally one tank by a hero of mine, this guy called Sergeant Jerry Waterhouse. And I'm very lucky. I got to speak to his daughter when I wrote Forgotten Armour, and she was incredibly helpful. And I wrote a very detailed account of actually what happened minute by minute in those 80 odd minutes. Because that's the thing. Like I say, 39 days they fight over that tennis court, and that tank clears it in 80 minutes with a battalion of the 2nd Dorsetshire Regiment. For those that are interested. It's a wonderful, wonderful action. No, I'm disappointed. I feel like Jerry Waterhouse is one of those guys that should probably have been given, he should have been awarded something, not like a Victoria Cross, the equivalent of the Medal of Honor, but, he should have got some sort of award. But, like so often, that was just seen as a day's work, and this battle, by the way, I've not even said it, it's also 4,000 feet up in the mountains.
I guess, there is some value in having tanks in that kind of environment. Like, I wouldn't have expected them to be there, kind of looking back at history, and maybe the Japanese didn't expect them to be there either.
Well, that's exactly what happens, and it happens again and again and again. And we mentioned the Japanese fighting in China. The Japanese end up stuck in this 1930s designed army because the pace of the Second World War, and in particular the miscalculation they have when they attack Pearl Harbor. I write in the book about how it is one of the greatest miscalculations in history, and I'm not trying to say that's any sort of big deal of analysis. A million other historians have said the exact same thing, but my point is that sort of cliche of it being such a big miscalculation, it is crucial to understanding why the Japanese end up fighting a 1930s army in a 1940s battlefield, because they're bringing anti-tank weapons, for example, that are only just good enough in 1942. So when the British bring medium tanks, and famously what they do is so sorry to do my tank nerdery for a moment. The American-designed M3 medium, which the British call the Lee, with its first turret, the American-designed turret, and then the British requested different turrets with the radio up in the turret, called the Grant tank. So the M3 Lee, Grant, different regiments have different ones in Burma. They were obsolete very, very quickly. They were like a stopgap design. It was so that they had the chassis for a armoured personnel carrier slash self-propelled gun, basically, that was being rushed into production whilst they were also finishing the design to the M4 Sherman, so the much more famous tank. And so they basically chuck a gun on this chassis. They couldn't make it into a normal one, and then they put another turret on top with a smaller gun, and they send that to fight in North Africa, and it's adequate, but it's not a brilliant design. It's far too tall. It's an easy target. It has a very large crew of 7, so it takes up a lot of manpower to run an armoured division on one of those, or an armoured brigade. You need a lot more men than you would do if you were using Shermans. For every sort of 4 tanks, you've lost one because you've got that extra manpower inside. But because they're obsolete in Europe, there's nothing obsolete about them in Burma. And in fact, the large crew is good because you need a lot of eyes on when you're in a tank fighting in Burma, because visibility is low and the Japanese are very, very good at stalking tanks and getting close to them. So they rely massively on the help from their infantry, but also eyes out of every single porthole and periscope that they've got. In fact, and I recount this in the book, to give the most extreme example of this, in March 1945, after they'd crossed the Irrawaddy River, so they're halfway through Burma, and the 3rd Carabiniers, who are one of those regiments that goes all the way through, they're in an action, and the commander of the tank, Captain Cornaby, he's directing his troops, and like so many tank commanders all over the Second World War, it's so difficult to see out of a tank that tank commanders constantly have their heads out in the open. Captain Cornaby is directing his gun, and 2 Japanese soldiers climb on the back of the tank. One of them is machine gunned off by a nearby tank, but the other one actually kills Captain Cornaby with his samurai sword. And that on its own is shocking enough. He then, as Captain Cornaby's body drops into the bottom of the turret, the Japanese officer then climbs into the tank turret, kills the gunner of the turret's gun, so now with his sword again, and that guy drops to the floor as well. And then he has a hand-to-hand fight inside the Lee tank's turret. And the gun is between the Japanese soldier on one side of the turret and the British soldier, Trooper Vernon Jenkins, classic British name, Jenkins. And he has this hand-to-hand fight with the Japanese soldier. He comes out with cuts on his hands and his arm. But basically the gun is essentially, the sort of the breach of the gun in the turret is saving his life. And he empties his 6-shot revolver against the Japanese guy inside the tank. The Japanese guy is still attacking him, and he has to, whilst defending himself with his left hand, unarmed, he reaches onto the floor and pulls the revolver out of one of the dead guy's holsters, and finally kills the Japanese soldier, who also then slumps. So there's 3 bodies in the bottom of the tank now. I'd never ever heard anything like that anywhere in the history of tank warfare anywhere. But I'm happy to be corrected, but I'm not aware. Happy to be corrected, but I'm not aware of an internal hand-to-hand fight inside a tank.
Yeah, if anybody out there knows of any other examples of that kind of scenario playing out, please let me know.
Absolutely.
And I think we're kind of coming up here on the end. So, thank you for coming on my podcast and shouting about your upcoming project. I'm definitely looking forward to checking it out.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So, yeah, it's the Forgotten War podcast with myself. So I'm Jack Browsher and Robert Lyman as well. Both of us have got a lot of books out as well. So, you can get my first book, Forgotten Armour, Tank Warfare in Burma. You can get it from Amazon, in America. And I've also got shortly coming up as well is my second book, which is called Thunder Run, Mekhtila 1945. That's coming out in June as well, which is about sort of the 1945. It's the final big battle, and it's this amazing one. I've called it Thunder Run, really off of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, actually, because what they basically do is Slim, the commander, he punches his armoured column through 80 miles behind Japanese lines, captures a town, holds it, and they survive off of aerial resupply and fight off Japanese counterattacks for about 5 weeks. Amazing, amazing story.
Oh, wait, I just remembered, and I have to bring this up. I love the cover for your book, Forgotten Armor. I love the art style. It stands out. It's different. It really catches the eye. Very cool. I really, really like how the book looks.
Yeah, and Thunder Run's of a similar theme. I have an incredible debt to Chiselbury Publishing, because they absolutely smashed it out of the park when they designed those book covers. They're works of art. They really are. I was thrilled to bits when I saw them because, in my head, I thought it was going to be, a fairly traditional, here's a black and white photo and that sort of thing. And I'd even prepared a couple of photos where I was like, well, if we're going to have a photo, this is the kind of thing. And he was like, I've got another idea. And he came back to me a few days later and they said, our guys have come up with this. Here it is. Absolutely love them to bits.
Again, thank you so much for joining me here to chat, and good luck with your project.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Wesley. Thank you again for having me on.